They had already taken her champagne flute before she could even sit down. Elara stood quietly near seat 1A, clutching her travel tote as a flight attendant. Tight smile, impatient eyes, stepped in front of her, hand raised like a traffic cop. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This cabin is for first-class passengers only." Elara blinked. "Yes, that's my seat." The attendant tilted her head, glanced at the boarding pass in Elara's hand, and then gave a quick once-over. Plain navy cardigan, loose linen pants, no designer bag, no diamond-studded carry-on, not even high heels, just clean, comfortable clothing and a calm demeanor. "I think you might be in the wrong cabin," the attendant said slowly, as if Elara were a child. Elara calmly handed over her boarding pass. The woman scanned it. Her eyes twitched. It did in fact say 1A, First Class, International, verified. "Oh, well, just, please be seated then," the attendant muttered, suddenly very interested in the papers on her clipboard. Elara nodded and took her seat, placing her bag neatly under the footrest. But the chill in the air remained. Another attendant passed by without offering the customary welcome drink. No one asked if she needed help adjusting the seat. When she requested a blanket, the response was curt. "We'll see if there are any extras." The other passengers, a mix of corporate elites, fashionably dressed influencers, and high-powered consultants, cast curious glances her way. Some were subtle, others were not. A man in seat 1C, wearing a blazer with no shirt underneath, and sporting a sleek travel pillow around his neck, leaned toward her and whispered, "Lost your way up from economy?" Elara turned her head slowly. "No, this is exactly where I'm meant to be." He chuckled, smug and dismissive, then pulled out his phone to record a video of the champagne he was offered, narrating it with a wink. "Cheers to flying with actual first-class passengers." She didn't react. Not with anger, not even with discomfort, just silence. Because what none of them knew, what not a single soul in that cabin suspected, was that the plane they were seated in, the airline they were proudly tagging on Instagram, the logo printed on the headrest behind their heads, it all belonged to the man who had just entered the terminal, the man whose name was on every jet engine, every pilot's checklist, every stockholder document. And that man was Elara's husband, and he was about to make sure that everyone on board understood exactly who she was. Back at the terminal, a private security officer had just stepped aside to let a sharply dressed man through a side gate. No waiting, no security check. His name was Kael Voss, and while most knew him from business headlines and Forbes features, few recognized him in person. That was because Kael rarely traveled with security details or entourages. He believed in precision, not flash. But today, his steps were faster. His calm was tight, because his phone had just buzzed with a text from Elara. Boarded. They're being interesting. That was all she said, but that was enough. Kael wasn't a man who lost his temper, but he was a man who took disrespect personally, especially when it was directed at the woman who had stood beside him before his name ever held weight. The woman who never asked for luxury, who preferred bookstores over boutiques, and who still made her own tea in the mornings despite having a live-in chef. She had never used his name for leverage, but now she wouldn't have to. As Kael approached the gate, the airline staff did a double take. The regional supervisor on duty instantly recognized him and nearly dropped the tablet in her hand. "Mr. Voss, we weren't expecting—" Kael didn't stop walking. "I'm boarding. Now." She scrambled to unlock the jet bridge controls. "Of course. Is there a problem?" "Yes," Kael said evenly. "Your staff just humiliated the owner's wife in first class." Her face drained of color. "Sir, I didn't—" "Don't speak. Just open the door." By the time he reached the aircraft, the pilot was already being notified via radio that Kael Voss was on board. The co-pilot stood from his seat to greet him, but Kael held up a hand and kept walking. No greetings, no pauses. Inside the first-class cabin, the flight attendants froze as soon as they saw him. Elara, seated in 1A with her hands calmly folded in her lap, met his eyes and offered the faintest of smiles. Kael's jaw clenched as he looked around the cabin. His eyes passed over each crew member, then swept across the other passengers, who had now realized something big was happening, but didn't yet know what. He turned to the same attendant who had denied Elara a blanket. "Which of you told my wife she was in the wrong cabin?" A cold hush fell over the plane. The attendant stammered, I didn't realize. Kael leaned in, his voice low and calm but sharp as glass. That is your failure, not hers. And then he did something no one expected. He pulled out his phone, tapped the airline's command interface and spoke 2 words into his comm system. Ground it. Within 60 seconds, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a last-minute technical directive from operations, this flight has been delayed. Please remain seated while we await further instructions. A collective groan swept through the cabin. Phones came out. Texts flew. Business schedules were wrecked. But Elara? She just leaned back in her seat, relaxed, as Kael took the one beside her. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The message had already been sent. The murmurs in first class began to swell into a confused, low buzz. People shifted in their seats, glancing toward the front of the cabin, wondering what kind of technical directive could bring an entire international flight to a halt after boarding. The man in 1C, who had earlier mocked Elara, opened his airline app and started furiously tapping, trying to figure out what was going on. Others began quietly speculating among themselves, eyes darting between Kael and Elara, slowly putting together who they were. Kael sat beside his wife, his presence calm but charged with authority. He didn't look around for attention. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply sat with one hand resting lightly on Elara's armrest, the other holding his phone as he began typing a message. An internal company notice that would soon reach every flight crew and corporate staff member within the airline. Meanwhile, the flight attendants were scrambling behind the curtain at the galley. The lead attendant, pale and sweating, was on the interphone with ground operations. Yes, he's on board. Yes, him. What do we do? Back in first class, Kael turned slightly toward the woman in charge. Yes, that attendant. The one who had not only denied Elara a blanket, but had questioned her presence from the start. What's your name? He asked softly. She straightened. Claire, sir. Claire, he said, his voice still level. Tell me, what was it about my wife that made you think she didn't belong here? Claire swallowed hard. I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, sometimes, passengers try to sneak into first class, and you thought she was one of them. Claire's silence was her answer. Kael stood. Every head turned to him. Every conversation died out. I own this airline, he began, not in arrogance, but in clarity. My name is on every jet, every contract, every fuel receipt. But none of that matters. What matters is that my wife, Elara, was treated as less than, simply because she didn't fit the image in your head of a first-class passenger. He paused, scanning the cabin. Even the most arrogant passengers were now watching with rapt, uncomfortable attention. This flight will not depart until the staff responsible for that judgment are removed and retrained. Not because I demand punishment, but because this culture needs to change. Gasps, shuffling. The captain himself appeared at the curtain, expression tight, clearly aware that a full disruption was now underway. Kael turned to Elara. You okay? She nodded, still calm. I'm fine. I just wanted to get to Paris. We will, Kael said, turning back to the crew. But not until this plane is clean. Not of dust, but of bias. And then, without waiting, he walked down the aisle toward the exit. They stepped off the aircraft together, leaving behind a cabin of people who now realized they hadn't just witnessed an interruption, they had witnessed a reckoning. The terminal buzzed with confusion as Kael and Elara stepped back through the gate doors. Ground staff whispered among themselves, phones buzzed with rapid updates from internal channels, and several airline executives were already en route to the terminal. News like this didn't stay quiet, not when the founder of the airline had grounded his own flight and walked off with his wife in full view of a plane full of elite passengers. Elara didn't say much. She never did. But Kael knew her well enough to see everything behind her silence. the disappointment, the hurt. Not because someone questioned her wealth or her seat, but because they had looked her in the eye and decided she didn't matter. And it wasn't the first time. Kael led her to the private executive lounge. Not the general first-class one, but the restricted section built for shareholders, dignitaries, and the few who helped shape the brand from day one. It was quiet, filled with hand-selected artwork and the scent of fresh orchids. A place designed for people like Elara, even if people like Claire hadn't realized it yet. Inside, Kael poured her a cup of tea himself, chamomile, just how she liked it. "They'll fix this," he said softly. "Not for me, for you." Elara looked up at him with that calm, steady gaze that had once made him rethink his entire business model. "Don't fix it for me," she replied. "Fix it so the next woman, who doesn't have your name, isn't treated like an intruder in a place she paid for." Kael nodded, the weight of her words sinking in deeper than any boardroom speech ever had. Outside the lounge, the flight remained grounded. Back at the aircraft, a team had arrived to deboard the crew responsible. The captain respectfully asked passengers for patience as operational changes were underway. Rumors swirled. Some said there had been a security breach, others guessed a technical fault. But the truth spread quickly. The owner's wife had been disrespected, and the owner had responded. Passengers whispered among themselves about Elara. The woman in 1C, the one with the champagne video, was now scrubbing her social media of anything that might come back to haunt her. The man who had made the economy comment sat with a frozen look on his face, silently reviewing how many NDAs he had signed in his career. Meanwhile, back in the lounge, Kael's phone rang. It was the airline COO. "We're reassigning the crew. Your internal statement's already gone viral on the company platform. I've had 20 department heads call me saying they're revising protocol manuals as we speak." "Good," Kael said. "And the press already knows something happened. We'll keep it contained, but you know how these things go." Kael looked over at Elara, who was sipping her tea, her expression as serene as ever. "Let them talk," he said. "Let them know what happens when you treat dignity like a privilege instead of a right." And with that, he ended the call and sat beside his wife. This wasn't about flexing power, it was about restoring balance. Because sometimes, when the world forgets who you are, you remind them, not with noise, but with action. An hour passed. The grounded aircraft was now being prepped with a new crew, one that had been called in, not just for service, but to bear witness to a standard that had been silently broken, and now loudly restored. Passengers remained on edge, not because of the delay, but because of what it meant. They had watched a woman enter without fanfare and be cast aside, and they had watched that same woman leave in quiet dignity, followed by the man who could rewrite their entire travel experience with a single instruction. In the executive lounge, Kael received a message. The new staff had arrived. The flight was ready to resume. He turned to Elara. "They've replaced the crew. Everything's in motion again." Elara didn't move right away. She took another sip of her tea and looked out the glass wall at the runway beyond. "Do you think they actually learned anything?" Kael considered that. Some did. Some probably never will. But that's not our job. Ours is to make sure the next woman like you doesn't have to walk through that again without being seen. She nodded slowly, then she stood. When they returned to the gate, every airline employee in the terminal straightened as if a general had entered. The same supervisor who had stammered earlier now bowed slightly, eyes wide, mouth pressed into a nervous line. Kael offered a nod. Elara offered a warmer smile, one that disarmed without surrendering her power. They boarded first, not because they demanded it, but because the entire terminal seemed to insist on it. Back in seat 1A, a fresh blanket had been folded with precision. A fresh tray of lavender-scented hand towels had been set beside her seat, and the in-flight chef had already sent word that her meal preferences were being honored. The staff bowed as she entered, not out of fear, but respect. Genuine this time. And just behind her, Kael took his place in 1B. The new lead flight attendant stepped forward, offering no excuses, just sincerity. "Mrs. Voss, we're honored to have you. If there's anything at all we can do, you only need to ask." Elara looked up, meeting her gaze with calm assurance. "Just treat everyone like they matter. That'll do." Those words rippled through the cabin in a way that no luxury ever could. It wasn't about perks or upgrades. It was about humanity, about being seen without needing validation. The other passengers, some still trying to figure out what had just happened, watched her with a different kind of curiosity now. Not the dismissive kind, the reverent kind. And when the jet began its slow taxi to the runway, everything inside that cabin had changed. The air was still luxurious, the seats still soft, the service still impeccable. But now the silence carried weight, the silence of realization, the silence of watching someone who had every right to scream, choose instead to rise. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Elara leaned her head gently against the seat, eyes closed, her breathing steady. The hum of the engines filled the silence, a quiet background to the storm that had already passed. But this wasn't a story about vengeance or spectacle. It was about something deeper, something most people on that plane wouldn't forget. Kael glanced sideways at her, his voice low and warm. "You handled that better than I ever could have." Elara opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "That's because I wasn't trying to make a statement. I just wanted to be seen." Kael reached over, his hand resting lightly over hers. "You always will be, whether they recognize you or not." Outside the window, the sky opened up in a soft blue glow, clouds parting like curtains. The flight attendants, now quiet and respectful, moved with precision and care, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Real change had swept through the aisles, not by force, but by presence. As dinner service began, Elara looked around, noticing the subtle shift in behavior from the passengers. They were polite now, a little more thoughtful. No one stared, but no one sneered either. Even the man in 1C who had earlier mocked her now kept his head down, his confidence visibly deflated. Whether he knew the full story or not, he understood enough. The woman he had dismissed was not someone to overlook, not because she was married to a billionaire, but because dignity does not wear a label. As the lights dimmed and passengers settled in for the long flight, Elara turned her gaze back to the clouds. She thought about how many times women like her, quiet, unassuming, powerful in ways unseen, had been overlooked, judged, shrugged off, and how sometimes all it took to shift the world around them was the truth being revealed at the right time. No shouting, no chaos, just a quiet moment of recognition. By the time the wheels touched down in Paris, the flight crew and passengers had already lived through more than a journey. They had witnessed a correction, a reminder that the first-class experience isn't about designer bags or gold cards. It's about how we treat people before we know who they are. And Elara, she exited the plane the same way she entered, graceful, calm, unbothered. But this time, every eye followed her not with judgment, but with respect.